It was the summer of 1944. Having broken their opponents in Normandy, the Allied armies were racing across France. The Germans were in full retreat. They had no prepared defenses to the west of the Rhine and no reserves left to fill the breaches in their lines. The tide of liberation was as dramatic as the German blitzkrieg 4 years before. Even the most cautious of commanders were talking of a final German defeat by Christmas. Surely, nothing could save Hitler now. Hitler insisted that the German army cling to its positions in Normandy until it was too late for an orderly withdrawal. The result was catastrophe. Instead of the fighting retreat across France envisaged by his generals, the German army collapsed in rout. US armored columns fanned out in pursuit, Allied aircraft strafing and bombing every road east. Between D-Day, the 6th of June, and the end of August 1944, the German army lost 221,000 men killed, missing, or captured in France. Another 67,000 were wounded. The Westheere began the campaign with 50 infantry divisions and 12 panzer divisions. By the time Feldmarschall Model gathered up the wreckage, there were only 24 infantry divisions and 11 panzer divisions. All had been reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength. The Allied armies had reached the Seine 11 days before they had expected to, and had freed Paris 55 days ahead of schedule. The American 7th Army, which landed on the French Riviera on the 15th of August, had broken German opposition in the south and linked up with Patton's forces by mid-September. At the same time, the American First Army had closed on the German city of Aachen. They were a full 8 months ahead of time. At last, the subjugated peoples of Europe could smile again. Everywhere, British and American troops were embraced as conquering heroes. Even the most pessimistic allowed themselves to think again of peace. However, the Allies' headlong rush was at its zenith. Tenacious resistance by German garrisons in French ports were restricting Allied supplies. The armies of liberation were short of frontline infantry replacements. Men were exhausted, vehicles in desperate need of overhaul. The helter-skelter advance slowed, then stopped. To retain the initiative, the British commander, Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, planned to break open the German defenses in the north before they had the chance to solidify. His idea was to land the British 1st Airborne Brigade and the Polish Parachute Brigade near the Dutch town of Arnhem behind the German lines. The Allied Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, expanded Montgomery's plan to include American troops. German defense rested on a succession of rivers running parallel to the front line. The first obstacles faced by the Allies were the Meuse-Escaut and the Zuid-Willems canals. Some 25 kilometers northeast lay the River Maas with a bridge at Grave. 15 kilometers northeast of Grave, there was a major bridge over the River Vaal at Nijmegen. A further 15 kilometers north of Nijmegen was the biggest obstacle of all, the Lower Rhine. There was a modern road bridge at Arnhem, plus a railway bridge and a ferry crossing just upstream. The strategy of Operation Market Garden was simple. 3.5 airborne divisions would land along a 100-kilometer corridor, and the ground forces would charge along it to link up with them within 3 days. If all went to plan, British tanks could be through Holland and into Germany's industrial heartland before winter. Given the collapse of German forces on the Eastern Front, the operation held out the prospect of an end to the war in 1944. Marshal Model anticipated an Allied airborne assault, but expected the blow to fall further to the east. Although he gave orders to prepare the target bridges for demolition, he withheld permission for their destruction. Model was intending to hold them intact for a planned counter-thrust. Some of his subordinate commanders criticized this after the war. They argued correctly that if all these bridges had been dynamited, the Arnhem campaign need never have happened. Furthermore, the demoralized German army did not have the capability for launching a sustained counterattack at that time. The British were confident of success. Military intelligence convinced them that the opposition to the elite paratroop formations would come only from second-rate German units consisting of old men, teenage conscripts, and Dutch SS men who could not wait to change sides. But the Germans had received timely reinforcements. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were being sent to the Arnhem area to refit and reorganize. Curiously, British intelligence lost track of both divisions, and their presence so near to the airborne landing zones upset the Allied plan from the very beginning. On Sunday, the 17th of September, the peoples of Britain and Holland looked skyward to an airborne armada heading south. A total of 1,545 transports and 478 gliders were in the air, escorted by 1,131 fighters. The formation was 16 kilometers across and 150 kilometers deep. Fewer than 50 Luftwaffe interceptors were available to attack, and they made little impression. Flak caught some as they neared the landing zones. But within 80 minutes, there were 20,000 paratroopers on the ground. Marshal Model himself fled his headquarters as US paratroops formed up nearby. At the same time, the British 30th Corps attacked along the road to Eindhoven. The advance of the tanks was preceded by a rolling artillery barrage that knocked out many of the German anti-tank guns that lay in wait in nearby woods. The US 101st Airborne Division captured the bridge over the canal at Wegel. The US 82nd Airborne took the bridge at Grave, but the bridge at Nijmegen was held by the SS, and although 2nd Para, commanded by 34-year-old Major John Frost, seized one end of the bridge at Arnhem, his battalion was then isolated. The rest of the British 1st Airborne Division was unable to get into Arnhem. Its way was blocked by determined German forces who had quickly formed ad hoc battle groups to blunt the British thrust towards the bridge. As one post-war British Army study commented, the 2nd SS Corps' reaction to the crisis read like a staff command and control exercise. General Dietrich's SS may have been in urgent need of rest and replenishment, but it reacted with blistering speed. The Allies couldn't have known that their entire battle plan had been recovered from a crash glider by the Germans. The Germans knew every detail of the Market Garden operation before it happened. By the afternoon of the 18th of September, tanks from the British Guards had linked up with the Americans at Eindhoven. A day later, the ground troops were in Nijmegen, an advance of nearly 80 kilometers in 48 hours. But the same day saw the British Airborne at Arnhem in increasing difficulty. 4th Para established a defensive perimeter around Oosterbeek outside the town. Relief was not to come to the embattled 2nd Para at the bridge, who were enduring a series of increasingly heavy assaults. A unit from the 10th SS Panzer Division was experiencing the same thing at Nijmegen. On the afternoon of the 20th, American infantry began to cross the Waal downstream, where the German defenders were thinly stretched. Within a few minutes' alert, German observers directed artillery and mortar fire onto the river. but the Americans gained a toehold on the east bank. The bridge itself was taken by a suicidal British tank platoon. The road to Arnhem lay open. However, 30th Corps was far behind schedule. The British in Arnhem had been expected to hold the bridge for just 2 days. So far, they had resisted for 4. The route to them, the road from Eindhoven to Arnhem, was christened Hell's Highway by the Americans, who had to hold it against repeated German counterattacks. The road, although a good one, was elevated on a bank for much of the way. Armour, moving along it, was an irresistible target for German gunners. There was no way round knocked-out vehicles. The surrounding terrain was waterlogged and could not support armour. 2nd Para's last stand ended in surrender on the 21st of September. Officers and men of 2nd SS Panzer Corps were united in praise for Frost's men and the rest of the division, now pinned against the Rhine. As one German NCO remembered, "This was a harder battle than any I fought in Russia. It was constant close-range hand-to-hand fighting. The English were everywhere. It was absolute hell." Another commented, "The only way to get the British out of the houses was feet first." The Germans dubbed the Arnhem sector the Witches' Cauldron. The Paras refused to stay in their perimeter and launched frequent counterattacks. The combatants gave no quarter, and there were atrocities on both sides. A final effort to save the British position in Arnhem came on the 21st of September. The British landed the Polish Parachute Brigade south of the Rhine, the other side of the river from the 1st Airborne Division. The Germans prevented them from breaking through to Arnhem. The next day, 2 Kampfgruppen counterattacked at Wegel to cut off lead elements of the British armour. The advancing 30th Corps was compelled to pull back one of its armoured brigades to keep the road open. On the 24th of September, the road was cut south of Wegel by the Jungwirth Battalion. The German battle groups suffered grievous losses, but they slowed the northward progress of 30th Corps just long enough for a new defensive line to be established north of Nijmegen. On the 25th of September, the British survivors were withdrawn over the Rhine. Just over 2,000 finally escaped. The Germans captured 6,000 men from 1st Airborne, more than half of them wounded. Within 24 hours of the withdrawal and surrender of 1st Airborne Division, Montgomery signalled London that the failure to secure a bridgehead over the Lower Rhine would not affect operations eastwards against the Ruhr. This was nonsense. Between them, Model and General Student had denied the Allies a strategic victory that could have dramatically foreshortened the war. The battle did not end with the loss of the Allied bridgehead. The forces north of Nijmegen were involved in heavy fighting in October. Total Allied casualties during Market Garden and its aftermath amounted to 13,000 men. German losses are estimated at between 6,000 and 8,000 men. Montgomery's gamble had failed. The blood of his elite troops had been spilt merely to gain a salient in the German line. At the conclusion of the Arnhem battle, the Allies could turn their full attention to the problem of Antwerp. Although this vital objective had been captured early in September, the port was not operational. Its approaches were guarded by strong German forces. But the Allies had to have access. It was key in building up supplies for the Allied push into the German industrial heartland. Hitler had sent strong reinforcements to bolster the defenders of the Scheldt estuary and deny the Allies the use of the port. 2 infantry divisions were in position, the 64th on the south bank in the Breskens pocket between Zeebrugge and the Brachmann Inlet, and the 70th in South Beverland. The Canadians of the Algonquin Regiment had attempted to break into the Breskens pocket while the Arnhem battle was in progress. They had been repulsed with heavy losses. By the end of September, the Canadian Army under General Simmons was deploying its infantry and armoured divisions for an all-out attack. The British 1st Corps and the Polish 1st Armoured Division were in support. All through October, they increased the pressure on both the pocket and the area of the neck of the Beverland Isthmus. Operations were assisted by Allied air supremacy. But the weather was threatening to break. Antwerp had to be secured before the Allied air fleet was grounded. Bombing by Lancasters and Mosquitoes destroyed vital dikes, and floods swept in across some of the defense works. Finally, however, it was decided that a full-scale amphibious landing on Walcheren was necessary. On the 1st of November, 4th Special Service Brigade, with 2 Royal Marine Commandos and 1 Army Commando, were landed at Vesti-Kapelle. It took them a week to quell all resistance on Walcheren, and with the Canadians another week, before all German positions along the Scheldt were safely in their hands. Even then, engineers had enormous problems of mine clearance and repairs to essential dockyard equipment. All of this could have been achieved before the onset of winter, but Arnhem had cost the Allies vital time. Now Christmas was only 2 weeks away. The weather was excessively cold, and most Allied soldiers of lesser rank than Major General wanted a break, at least until the new year. By mid-December 1944, the main bulk of the Allied forces and the attentions of Allied High Command were concentrated towards both ends of the battlefront. The Anglo-Canadian armies were in the north around Antwerp, and the US 1st and 9th Armies were set to close up to the Neder Rhine, where they threatened the vital Ruhr dams. In the south, General Patton's US 3rd Army, after its spectacular drive across France, was poised to sweep through the equally important Saar region towards the Rhine. Between the two powerful groupings were strung out some 80,000 American troops along 90 miles of front. The bulk of these consisted of General Middleton's 8th Corps, which had been brought across from Brittany. They were backed by 1 armoured division, the 9th, which had not yet seen action. They were stationed here because this part of the front, the Ardennes section, was quiet. Its approaches were covered by the sparsely settled German Schneeeifel, and behind by steep wooded hills and foaming trout streams, which had always been regarded as unsuitable country for open warfare. The first winter snows had fallen, and heavy clouds overhead kept the Allied and German air forces on the ground. Green and veteran troops alike, crouched in their foxholes, listened thankfully to reports of bitter fighting to north and south, and dreamt of Christmas. Even as the fighting in the Falaise Gap was ending, Hitler had announced that by November a force of some 25 divisions must be prepared to launch a huge counter-offensive against the Anglo-American armies. To the astonishment of the German High Command, that force had come into existence. It had been conjured from every corner of Germany: rear area administrative echelons, 16-year-old boys, civil servants, small shopkeepers, university students, and the scourings of the prisons had been swept into the armed services. They were fashioned into the new so-called Volksgrenadier divisions. Himmler had been appointed to take control of their formation and training. The new troops fell far short of Himmler's intended ideological warriors, but they were well equipped. The Reich's factories were still producing surprisingly large quantities of weaponry, despite the round-the-clock pounding by the Allied bomber fleets. Infantry had plentiful supplies of Panzerfausts and new semi-automatic weapons. The Panzer formations were being fitted out with some of the best armor then in service. This included the King Tiger, which was virtually impervious to Allied guns and could command the battlefield with a new long-barreled 88mm gun. There were also large numbers of Panther tanks available, whose early design faults had now been virtually ironed out. 3 German armies had been created for Hitler's last offensive in the West. By mid-December, they had been marshalled under an exemplary cloak of secrecy and subterfuge, opposite that thinly occupied 90-mile strip of line so tenuously held by the US 8th Corps. In the north were poised the units of the 6th SS Panzer Army, under General Sepp Dietrich, erstwhile commander of Hitler's personal bodyguard in the street-fighting days, and later of the crack Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler 1st SS Panzer Division. In the middle section of the attack front waited the 5th Panzer Army under the trusted Army General and Panzer expert Hasso von Manteuffel. And on the southern flank of the attack, to form the hard shoulder against any possible Allied counterattack, was the 7th Army under the dogged but unimaginative General Erich Brandenburger. Altogether, some 200,000 men would take part in Operation Wacht am Rhein, equipped with more tanks, more artillery, and more ammunition than had been granted to any similarly assembled German force for many months past. In addition to the conventional fighting divisions were 1,250 paratroops under Colonel von der Heiter, a veteran of Crete. They were to drop in front of the main assault, seize bridges and crossroads, and attack any headquarter organizations they could find. To help them spread panic in the American rear, the famous raiding commander Otto Skorzeny commanded a special force of volunteers. These men would drive American vehicles and wear American uniforms. Many of them were summarily executed when they later fell into Allied hands. The German objective of Wacht am Rhein was far too ambitious. Hitler planned to take Antwerp, split the Allied armies threatening the German frontier, and annihilate the Anglo-Canadian armies and the US 1st and 9th armies alongside them. He predicted that Allied cooperation would then break down and wreck future strategic planning for weeks and possibly months. "If we succeed," enthused Hitler, "we will have knocked out half the enemy front. Then let's see what happens." The more clear-headed planning staff of the German Army HQ had looked at a small solution, a pincer attack that would cut off US forces, but Hitler wanted a rerun of May 1940. Most of the commanders tasked with the operation were not impressed by the Führer's grand strategy. Sepp Dietrich, who would seem by now to have lost his original admiration for the Führer, later remarked, "All I had to do was cross the river, capture Brussels, and then go on to take the port of Antwerp. The snow was waist deep and there wasn't room to deploy 4 tanks abreast, let alone 6 armored divisions. It didn't get light until 8 and was dark again at 4, and my tanks can't fight at night, and all this at Christmas time." Feldmarschall Model, famously dubbed the Führer's fireman, was quoted as saying, "This plan hasn't got a damn leg to stand on." Lastly, the venerable Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, whom Hitler had placed in overall command of the front, commented, "Antwerp, if we reach the Meuse, we should go down on our knees and thank God." But the attack went ahead. At 5:30 a.m. on the 16th of December 1944, in the fog-shrouded snow-covered hills of the Belgian Ardennes, after a short but intense bombardment, 200,000 men of German Army Group B threw themselves against the Allied positions. Aided by that essential factor of surprise, some of them did very well at the beginning. They pushed forward under cloudy skies. This was known as Führer's weather because the Allied air forces could not deploy. Under the shock of the attack, some 9,000 men from the 106th US Infantry Division were captured on the Schnee Eifel on December the 19th. In the meantime, to the south, a Kampfgruppe battle group, commanded by 29-year-old Standartenführer Joachim Jochen Peiper, part of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, was enjoying success and infamy in equal measure. On the 19th of December, a truck convoy of the American 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was intercepted southeast of Malmedy. Peiper's troops had earned the nickname Blowtorch Battalion after burning their way across Russia, and had also been responsible for slaughtering civilians in 2 separate villages. Upon sighting the trucks, the Panzer tanks opened fire and destroyed the lead vehicles. This brought the convoy to a halt while the deadly accurate tank fire continued. The outgunned Americans abandoned their vehicles and surrendered. The captors, then opened fire on the prisoners. Survivors were killed by a pistol shot to the head, in some cases by English-speaking SS, who walked among the victims asking if anyone was injured or needed help. Those who responded were shot. A total of 81 Americans were killed in the single worst atrocity against US troops during World War II in Europe. Two survivors escaped and reached the Allied lines, where their story roused intense fury. News of the massacre strengthened the resistance of even the greenest units. Crucially, however, German units failed to secure the massive Allied fuel dump at Stavelot. This doomed the German attack. The Axis had entered the war short of fuel and were plagued by lack of supplies from the middle of the 1941 campaign in Russia. Mobility of the panzers and the Ardennes operation depended on capturing the enemy's abundant stocks of fuel. With their loss, the panzers' fuel tanks would soon run dry. One of Manteuffel's spearheads had success similar to Piper's, but without that ruthlessness. His forces reached as far as the vital road junction of Saint-Vith, but here it ran into the tank destroyers and the main artillery of an American infantry division, which held them, forcing the main drive of Manteuffel's army southwards into the gap between Saint-Vith and the other main road junction, Bastogne. It was here that the attentions of both attackers and defenders became concentrated. General Bradley's 12th Army Group caught the offensive in its central section. At first, Bradley wrote it off as merely a spoiling attack to disrupt the First Army's threat to the Ruhr in the north and the Third Army's to the Saar in the south. But he soon realized that it was more than that. On the 19th of December, he ordered General Hodges in the north to swing some of his First Army divisions back to hold a flank and then drive down to Saint-Vith. He ordered Patton to do the same in the south and send his crack 4th Armored Division up to relieve Bastogne. Being Patton, of course, he objected, but then soon cheered up. What the hell, he said, we're still killing crowds. With an efficiency which commands the greatest admiration, he swung the bulk of his army through 90 degrees in 48 hours. In the meantime, General Eisenhower had released his reserves. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, recently recovered from their battles at Nijmegen and Eindhoven, raced north from Patton's lines. The men of the 101st, the Screaming Eagles, deployed to begin their famous stand at Bastogne, and the 82nd passed on to Saint-Vith. The battle now was becoming one of mobility, and that game the Americans knew how to play. As Manteuffel's spearheads probed farther and farther west, they never crossed the Meuse, though the 11th Panzer Division did reach nearly to Dinant. American tank destroyers and artillery shored up the flanks of the penetration, while their infantry fought doggedly forward into the gaps or held on grimly in isolated positions. For most of the time, moreover, they fought without air cover, for the weather favored the Germans for days on end. But by Christmas Day, after some of the bitterest fighting seen in Europe, the sting had been drawn from the German onslaught. Although Manteufel mounted a last desperate attack on Bastogne, it was beaten off, and on the following day, Patton's tanks arrived to break the siege. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Montgomery had taken command of the northern flank, and in order to tidy up the battlefield, he authorized a withdrawal from the Saint-Vith salient and brought the British 29th Armored Brigade down on the Americans' right flank to hold the deepest penetration. When, on the following day, the whole of the US 2nd Armored Division came down to join them, Hitler's last offensive in the West was brought to a halt. Allied ground operations now enjoyed air cover. The weather had cleared up, and Allied air forces came out in strength, with fighter bombers attacking German vehicles and artillery positions, and medium bombers the crowded road and rail network in Germany. The good visibility also allowed supplies to be airdropped by C-47s to the 101st Division in Bastogne. It was symptomatic of the state of German planning that the Luftwaffe only deployed in significant numbers on the 1st of January. On that day, Unternehmen Bodenplatte was launched. 800 fighters attacked Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland and engaged Allied interceptors. But it was too late to affect the outcome. This final spectacular gesture cost the Allies about 500 aircraft, including General Montgomery's personal C-47. But these were planes that could be replaced in under a fortnight, and there were virtually no aircrew casualties. The 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr had been halted, and by January the 4th, the US 1st and 3rd Armies were beginning to counterattack along the salient that had become known as the Bulge by Allied staffs. The German High Command realized that Wacht am Rhein had run its course. It would not be until January the 8th that Hitler finally authorized a withdrawal. A week later, the Germans were pushed back to their start lines on the border. The German offensive had undoubtedly given the Allied leaders a nasty jolt, but the drive had used up a great deal of the rapidly diminishing German war material and manpower, which could have been used to greater effect on the other side of the Rhine. In the final analysis, in the 6th year of war, the quality of German fighting troops was inferior to its opponents. The Germans had been defeated by the ability of American leadership to deploy guns and armor with supreme efficiency, and by the dogged courage of the American infantrymen. The Battle of the Bulge cost each side about 800 tanks. The Germans lost 1,000 aircraft and suffered 100,000 casualties. The Americans 81,000 and the British 1,400. Wacht am Rhein had wiped out the German reserve and hastened the final collapse. In the early spring of 1945, once the thaw had set in, the Allies mounted their offensive across the Rhine. Hitler's exhausted troops would now be fighting for the sacred soil of Germany.